Well, g'day everyone. Welcome to another week of our Chronological Bible Reading Plan and another weekend, of course. That's why you can hear lawnmowers in the background, okay? So just a typical weekend. If you're following these YouTube tutorials live as they come on air, it's also the first week of July. So happy new financial year to those of you to whom that is relevant. All right, this week, last week we finished the book of Samuel, which means this week we get to start the book of Kings. Kings is basically the sequel to Samuel, okay? They just, boom, go straight into one another. And like Samuel, the book of Kings was originally written as one book that was then divided into two volumes when the Bible was put into Greek around 300 to 400 BC. The split between 1st and 2nd Kings happens around about the time when Elijah hands over to Elisha. Okay, so we'll get there in a couple of weeks. So the book of Kings, though, is not primarily about the prophets, although Elijah and Elisha are major characters in the book. The book of Kings is primarily about kings, okay? Bit of a giveaway. So while it starts with David handing over to Solomon, after Solomon's death, Israel splits into two kingdoms. Each of those kingdoms have about 20 kings each, until both of them are destroyed by foreign armies, and that whole period of time spans about 400 years. Okay, so the big picture view of Kings is that it's a 400-year period between the death of David and the destruction of Jerusalem when God's people are taken into Babylon, into exile. But we'll look at that again in a couple of weeks' time. There's three things we're doing this week. Number one, we're reading narrative, as always, 1 Kings 1 to 4, and then 2 Chronicles chapter 1, which parallels it. So 5 chapters of narrative. We're reading 18 Psalms, and we're reading the entire book of Song of Solomon. So there's three things we're doing this week. I'm going to mention a couple of key things about each of those three things in just a moment. But before I do, I want to suggest to you that before you start your readings in Kings this week, you go visit a website that I've recently found called The Bible Project. And basically the guys on the Bible Project put animation to each of the books of the Bible to help you to see the big picture. They basically do what I'm trying to do now, help you to stand back and see the big picture view of the scripture, okay? So go to thebibleproject.com, look up the book of Kings, and I think if it's about 8 or 10 minutes long, they will show you everything that happens in a book of Kings to help you have a big picture view of that, okay? But this week, all we're doing is reading the first 4 chapters of Kings. It parallels, as I said, with 2 Chronicles chapter 1, and this is basically what we see in the first thing, which is the narrative. First thing we see is that David dies, okay, or as the Hebrews say, he was gathered to his fathers, all right? The same phrase we saw in Genesis and Moses and Joshua, etc., gathered to his fathers. Solomon obviously takes over his throne. There's a little bit of an upset that we read about in Kings where one of his half-brothers thinks that he's entitled to the throne. After all, he was the next in line according to age, but age doesn't matter, okay? Firstborn, eldest, as we see, doesn't really matter through the scriptures. It's whom God has chosen. So Solomon makes it very clear. Now listen, I'm the one that God has chosen. I'm taking the throne. David appoints him, and basically it's a pretty clean succession, okay? There are a couple of things that happen in chapter 2 of Kings where Solomon asserts his authority. Basically, he puts other people to death, including that brother who sought to take his throne, but for a different reason, okay, which we'll get to in Song of Solomon. Basically, he wants to marry a girl that I think Solomon loved. We'll get to that later. And the other thing that happens is that, what else happens? Oh, Solomon has his famous dream, okay, where he asks God for wisdom and discernment of heart to lead his people. And it's no coincidence that that dream takes place at a place called Gibeon, all right? Gibeon was where the sanctuary, the tabernacle that Moses built, that they walked around with for 40 years in the desert, that tent was in Gibeon. Now, somewhere along the line, the tent and the Ark of the Covenant had been split. The Ark of the Covenant is now in Jerusalem. David brought it there, but the tent is kept in a place called Gibeon, which is around about 10 kilometers away. It is there that Solomon has his dream and God appears to him, which is probably no mistake or coincidence, okay, that the tabernacle of Moses is where God speaks to the man who will build the temple, because it will be the temple that ends up replacing that tabernacle, and that tabernacle is never, ever used again. Okay, so that's where he has his dream. And basically what we find out this week is it describes the glory days of Solomon's reign, where Solomon basically is doing a really good job, and it becomes the good old days of Israel's history. They are peaceful, they are prosperous, other nations look to them and recognize God's wisdom on Solomon and on his kingdom, and so it really does. The other thing we read this week is some summary of the glory days of Israel. And what I noticed this week, and you'll probably notice as well, even though it talks about the glory days of Israel, as it describes Solomon's rule, it hints at some of the very things that Moses warned about hundreds of years earlier. You remember Deuteronomy 17 when Moses says in the future you're going to ask for a king, and it said, but make sure he doesn't take many wives, which Solomon does. Make sure he doesn't accumulate much wealth, which Solomon does. It also says very specifically, make sure he doesn't go back to Egypt to get horses for himself. Well, guess what we read this week? Solomon, in all his prosperity, gets horses for himself from Egypt. And even though it's written in a passage that talks about how this seems to be a good thing, how prosperous Solomon was, you and I know, having read the whole book, there's kind of like hints that, hey, things are not going to go well for this king in the end. So anyway, you know that now. Your eyes, I hope what you're starting to do, now that you're reading the Bible chronologically, is you're starting to see these dots join as we read. Okay, so notice that this week. The other thing you're going to be doing is reading 18 Psalms. I want to talk just about 4 of them this week, because 4 of them are what are called acrostic Psalms. Okay, and basically it's a way of writing where each line of the Psalm begins with the letters of the alphabet in alphabetical order. Okay, so the Hebrews had 22 letters in their alphabet. I don't know what they are, A, B, C, D, the equivalent. Okay, 22 of them. Psalm 111 and 112 that you're going to be reading this week are only 10 verses in English. But in Hebrew, it's 22 lines. And each line begins with each letter of the Hebrew alphabet. That is called an acrostic psalm. There's another one, Psalm 37, written by David, incidentally, which has 40 verses, so it's longer, but the 40 verses are split into 22 stanzas. And each stanza begins, or paragraph, stanza, begins with the letters of the alphabet as they go. In fact, as you read that one, it's basically 22 proverbs of David. That's all it is. It's like a conglomeration of proverbs written as a psalm. But the most famous acrostic psalm that you're going to be reading this week is Psalm 119. Ring any bells? It should. Psalm 119 is the longest psalm in the Bible, the longest chapter that we have in the Bible. And again, it is an acrostic masterpiece, okay? There are 176 verses in Psalm 119, but of those 176 verses, it is split into 22 stanzas. Each of those stanzas begin with the letters of the alphabet, and within each stanza are 8 lines, okay? And each of those 8 lines begins with that letter that is represented in the stanza, okay? So basically, A, okay, whatever the equivalent is, the first 8 lines all begin with A. And then the second stanza, B. The next, all 8 lines all begin with B, okay? So that's why Psalm 119 is really repetitive. You're reading it, it's going on about God's word and statutes and all this type of thing. You're like, God, this is long. It's like a whole bunch of proverbs put together. Yes, that's exactly what it is, all right? It's not written as a song. It's not written to be sung. It is written as a piece of poetry that you can only really appreciate as you read it on paper in Hebrew. Okay, so that is an acrostic form, and those 4 big ones is what you're going to be seeing this week. So enjoy them, and by all means, read Psalm 119 in one sitting, because there are some real good nuggets in there. There's some great wisdom and proverbs that are hidden in those Psalms, which brings us to the last thing we're going to be reading this week, the Song of Solomon, which is a song, but also a book of wisdom, because it teaches us wisdom about some of the biggest issues in life: love, sex, and marriage. That is what the Song of Solomon is about. I insist that you read it in one sitting. It's 8 chapters, but you can read it easy in one sitting. And if you want to spice things up a bit, go get Brian Simmons, the Passion Translation, and read it in that, because he's got some really interesting insights in his commentary as you go. Basically, the Song of Solomon is an ancient love poetry, okay? And even Egypt had love poetry that followed a very, very similar format. You have a male singer, you have a female singer, and you have a chorus line who also sings, okay? So these 3 kind of characters. Sometimes they sing solos, and sometimes they sing duets to one another. So it's written as a poem, but as you read it, I want you to imagine a musical on a stage. Okay, with a lead singer that is male, a lead singer that is female, and a chorus line, and these guys are singing to one another. That's basically what it is. It's a song of songs being sung to one another as love poetry, expressing this great love between this man and this woman. Now, it's placed in the middle of our Bible because it shares wisdom about love, sex, and marriage, and because, of course, it is, as you can see from that format, it is a non-literal story. It's not a historical story. It is poetry. Okay, it's a fictional story. However, it is based on real-life characters, just like when you see a movie and it says, based on a real-life story. Now, the question is, who is this song based on? Well, the male seems quite obvious to be King Solomon, but who is the Shulamite woman? I have a theory, and this is where we go back to the first thing we read this week, which is 1 Kings chapter 1 and 2, that the term Shulamite and the term Shunammite, just one letter difference, actually speak of the same person. And this is a theory embraced by many people. It's not controversial at all. But I believe that the woman that Solomon is so in love with is the young virgin girl that slept at the feet of David in his dying days. You're going to be reading about that in the first couple of chapters. David never slept with her. She was a virgin, not one of his concubines. She attended to him in his dying days. And so I believe that's why Solomon sings to this girl that he fell in love with and refers to her as his sister, the one who looked after his dad, his sister and his bride. I believe that's also why when his brother wanted to marry this young virgin, he got so angry he put that brother to death. Why? Because one of the reasons, he was passionately in love with this young girl, and that jealousy drove him to that. Is it possible? Well, you can read and do your own study on that this week. What many people agree with, though, is that it is a prophetic picture, not just a love story of husband and wife, but a prophetic picture of Jesus' love for his bride, the church. And although it's not explicitly said, this song is not quoted in the New Testament or anything, it is a commonly held idea that this love story shows us the great passion that Jesus has for his church. So whether you're reading it from a historical point of view, or whether you're reading it devotionally, or whether you're reading it just to spice up your own love life, go for it. Enjoy Song of Solomon this week. All right, guys, have a great week of readings. Don't forget to check out thebibleproject.com and see whether that helps you in your readings this week. I've gone 13 minutes. That's long enough. Bless you. Have a great week. Bye.